Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. Everyone comfortable? A few nods. We've got a fantastic lineup tonight, and I think it's fair to say we're very privileged to have the guests with us that we have. The discussion, So You Want a Revolution, or You Want to Start a Revolution, is focusing on the Arab Spring. I think everyone here probably is aware of the events that have unfolded throughout the course of this year across the Arab world. Began as an Arab Spring, but went into a summer and an autumn, and shortly it'll go into a winter. So it is very much a work in progress. And so the purpose of the discussion tonight really is to dissect what it is that we're seeing and where it might go from here, with some people that have some fascinating and very much first-hand insights into the Arab world at the moment. Well, joining us here this evening is Her Excellency, Mrs. Rima Ahmad Alaadeen, who is the Ambassador for the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan here in Australia. So could we please give her a very warm welcome?
Thank you.
Next to her is Professor Bob Bowker, who is a specialist on Middle East and Islamic issues and an adjunct professor at the Centre for Arab and Islamic Studies until December of 2012 at the ANU. He's also a former diplomat for the Australian Diplomatic Service, DFAT. Please welcome him. Samah Hadid, a famous face here in Australia. She's always on Q&A. Human rights activist. In 2010, she was the Australian Youth Representative to the UN. Fantastic speaker and somebody with real experience on the ground in some of these countries this year. Please welcome her. And fresh back from Tunisia is Professor Fethi Mansouri, who's the Director for the Centre for Citizenship and Globalisation at Deakin University. Thank you very much. Fethi Mansouri, we learned during the sound checks what everyone had for breakfast. We didn't find out what you had, so please tell everybody, just so we can check your audio.
Breakfast cereals.
All right. Let's just start, if we can, with the ambassador, because I think you're probably, closest, if you like, to the heart of this, at least at a political and diplomatic level. For the benefit of our audience, what is it that we're seeing unfold in the Arab world this year? Because it's not really one homogenous event. It's lots of different, but still interconnected events.
Absolutely, Hamish. Now, what my region is going through is a complete transformation. This Arab Spring has not only surprised the world, but it actually surprised the Arabs themselves. We never knew that we had this vibrant energy, this revolutionary reservoir, if you wish, that was able to explode when it did. And I think the Arab Spring is a phenomena worthy of strategical analysis, worthy of the enormous attention that it has been getting from the media throughout the world. It is changing the social norms or social beliefs about the Middle East, and people around the world are trying to study and analyze this phenomena. This reminds me of something Lenin, the Bolshevik leader, said, that every revolution to succeed has to have some prerequisites, like a clear leadership, a party, and a working program. I wonder what Lenin would say now if he saw what has taken place, how the revolutions in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, how they have turned out to be. Indeed, this specific nature of the Arab Spring makes it also susceptible to counter movements from various political stances in each country, from Islamists, from political parties who were not actually there when the revolution took place, and they suddenly just woke up and wanted to, if you wish, hijack this incredible achievement or claim monopoly over political reforms and social justice. But I believe that the most important aspect or the most important thing that characterizes the Arab Spring is a very fundamental aspect. It's the army. It was the army in Tunisia and Egypt who finally, eventually came into the picture and ousted both presidents in those countries. It is the army right now in Syria and Yemen that are keeping the presidents of those people, of those countries, holding their ground. So in Libya, it was a bit different, as you know. In Libya, the army was divided between the rebels and the regime, but eventually NATO came in and, to the advantage of the rebels.
Okay, so we acknowledge that Lenin might be surprised to see what's happening there. In a word, did it take you by surprise?
Absolutely, it did. Nobody can claim otherwise, not in the Arab world or in the Western world. But as you mentioned, Hamish, it is very wrong to have this simplistic approach of assuming that all the Arab countries are the same and on the same footing of the democracy or the absence of the democracy in terms of human rights, in terms of economic wealth, in terms of political reforms. Each country is different. Subsequently, each country has a different, the public has a different demands. But also, we have to acknowledge that no country in the region is immune. What happened in Tunisia and in Egypt can best be described as a tsunami. So, and it is worthy of studying and understanding. And we are, even the Arab leaders and the Arab countries, we're learning along the way how to take this in, how to digest what's happening, and this is only the beginning. And people who believe that things are not moving forward as fast as possible actually are, I believe, in my opinion, are wrong, because this is a rebirth of nations, and rebirth, it takes decades rather than months and weeks and short time.
All right, well, that's probably a good opportunity to bring in Professor Fethi Mansouri, because you've just returned from Tunisia, the place where this began, and the place which is perhaps most advanced in terms of that process that the ambassador was just referring to. There'll be an election there this weekend. Give us a snapshot of where Tunisia is at right now.
Well, I think the Tunisian example is extremely important, simply because if you look at what's happening across the region from Morocco all the way to the Gulf, you find that there are different levels of progress, if you like, with regard to this huge democratization or political reform agenda that's been started in Tunisia. Tunisia is probably by far the most advanced on this transformational path, if you like. The elections will be held this weekend, 23rd of October, to basically elect a constituent assembly. And the function of the assembly will be really to draft a new constitution and to embark on an extremely ambitious political reform agenda. It will also replace the current interim government, if you like, by a transitional government, which will stay in power for about 1 year and really start the process of preparing for the presidential and legislative elections in Tunisia within 12 months period. But I would like to perhaps provide a little bit of, by way of furthering on what the ambassador was just saying, why this is an extremely important set of political events that are taking place. I think for two reasons, in my view. One is that we have been, and when I say we, I mean we in the West, we have been told repeatedly that change, significant change in the Arab world, the Arab/Muslim world, if you like, can only happen through one of three, perhaps, means: either assassinations, military coups, or perhaps foreign intervention. What's happened in Tunisia and Egypt has proven that that's actually a myth. It's been deconstructed. That Arab people, Muslim people, are able to perhaps have a dream of embarking on a process of bringing about change without resorting to coups and assassinations and foreign interventions. That's the first thing I would like to. The second thing is that there has always been a kind of a bit of a fear, a deep-seated fear, that should change come to the Arab world with all the despotic, authoritarian, corrupt regimes, it will only come through a kind of your clerics, you know, the conservative Islamists who would threaten to demolish everything and cut everything, the ties with the West. Well, what's happened in Tunisia has shown beyond any shred of doubt that it was led by young people, leaderless if you like, had no identified leaders, had no religious dogmas behind them. Even better, they had no political parties or other organizations behind them. So it was a grassroots organic movement that developed from the bottom up and really had three key demands. And it's worth reminding everyone of those demands. And I can summarize them in 3 words. Basically, it was bread, that is economic reform. It was dignity, that is restoring social justice, and also corruption, that is restoring an element of political accountability to the systems where they lived. So those are the 3 key problems that have been really simmering behind the surface across the Arab world, and that's exactly what led to what happened in Tunisia. And then when we say there was a political tsunami, I think it's perhaps a little bit incorrect to claim that, because if you study below the surface, you know that there's a cycle. And the cycle will tell you that the independence from the Western colonizers in Tunis, North Africa, and the Gulf has not really led to a genuine form of independence. There was this dependency on the West. There was this regime that had a bit of legitimacy, but then became basically devoid of that legitimacy, and their people were demanding, you're not legitimate anymore. We're still, you're not delivering politically, economically, and socially. Therefore, what are you there for? We need a change. And when the regimes were not responding to young people demanding change, then young people took to the streets, and they knew that once they were able to achieve significant, if you like, change, then it will lead to more significant development.
Did you perceive there any sense of ownership, if you like, from the Tunisian community over what has happened elsewhere? Is there a pride?
I'm a Tunisian background. I'm very proud of it. I can tell you that. We're very proud of it.
You've changed the world.
We're very proud of it because, I mean, as I said, there was a psychological fear. There was a psychological obstacle, if you like, that you're not capable of doing this. Look at Iraq. The Americans went there and built trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of people killed just to remove Saddam, and then end up with a system that's still questionable in many aspects. And similar things happened elsewhere. So the notion that we can bring about change from within our societies, ingrained in social institutions, driven by civil society by and large, is a momentous achievement for the Arab Islamic world. And as I said, you have to remember that Tunisia is 99% Muslim. Yet political Islam was not the driving force behind this. And also, the fact that people were wanting democracy, as in democracy not necessarily in a Western kind of a dress, but democracy as in transparency and accountability and an accountable system of governance, shows you that those values are not really owned by any specific culture, that every single community can strive for that, and it's possible for them to achieve it. And I think that's really the biggest breakthrough that came out of the the so-called Arab Spring. I don't like to use that expression, but since you're using it here, I'll use it for you.
Is that because of the season, or because you consider yourself North African?
Because because I'm a North African.
Right, okay.
We prefer summer.
I want to bring in Professor Bowker here, because you've been a Western diplomat in both Jordan and Egypt. You were the Australian ambassador in both. For decades, the West has been calling for freedom, democracy, free speech in the Arab world. Suddenly you had tens, hundreds of thousands of people on the streets demanding that, yet Western powers were still backing the regimes that those very people wanted to change. And it was perceived in many circumstances as hypocritical. Do you think that's a reasonable conclusion for young Arabs out on the streets to draw?
It's certainly a reasonable conclusion for young Arabs to draw. From a diplomat's perspective, and I can now talk about them objectively, there is an issue when regimes change. it's all very well to suggest that one should get on the back of the tiger, but it's important also to firstly look at the disposition of the tiger and its general direction, because you don't know quite what you're going to be throwing away in transferring that support. And there was, I think, an extended period of prevarication among many Western countries because they weren't really clear in their own minds about what was happening. As the ambassador said, these events caught most people by surprise. And
so they weren't sure which horse to back.
Well, it wasn't even clear how many horses were running in the race. And although one can argue that there is a certain importance to be attached to values, liberal democratic values and so on, there are also issues of national interest that need to be evaluated before one starts committing oneself in any particular direction. I'm not saying that's right, but I'm saying that is reality that most governments have to deal with. I would add also that, as the ambassadors managed to mention Lenin in the first 2 minutes, I should put in a bid for Zhou Enlai, the Chinese statesman. When he was asked what he thought of the French Revolution, he said, well, it's still a bit too early to tell. And there's an element of that, I think, that has to be brought into this discussion. My own personal view, as I said, now stepping back from the business of diplomacy, is that what we need to be doing in the West is demonstrating through our own values and through the efforts that we make to respond, not to insert our support, but to respond where assistance is requested by the Arab world to those requests. There is not a problem of institution building in the Arab world. It's a problem of dysfunctionality in existing institutions, government bodies, constitutional arrangements and so on, that the Arab Spring, or the revitalisation of Arab politics, is going to seek to address. How that will come out is still too early to tell. But what we need to be doing is extending support to those who would seek to expand the space for critical thinking and democratic debate in Arab societies as they move through this process. We don't want to be picking winners because we don't know quite what the Arab states themselves will decide they want to be. But it is important for us to at least have our values as those to which people can refer as examples of how societies may behave.
Samah Hadid, you've been on the streets of Syria, on the streets of Egypt this year. Do you think that there is a different perception, a different take on that whole issue of hypocrisy there? Do people look at the broader situation and say, well, the West intervened in Libya and brought in bombers and ousted Gaddafi, but they're leaving us here in Syria to rot?
What I find more is a sense of incredible pride among Egyptians especially, that they have done this for themselves. That slogan that was going around Tahrir Square, Egyptians hold your head high for you are now free, is the one that matters. Yeah. You'll find some discussion in the margins about who might have done more, how long the West should have stayed in general support of Mubarak, arguing for an extended transition period and so on. But that's pretty marginal to the discussion now. The more important thing is young people especially feeling that they have something that is incredibly important, thinking about how they can protect and preserve and promote those values in the face of what is becoming a very difficult struggle for them. Because for all the enthusiasm and the commitment that has been shown by young people to this revolution, they have, by virtue of being largely amorphous, leaderless, lacking in political coherence and communication skills, increasingly been outgunned by those who, as the ambassador said, are from the military, who have the interim responsibility for governance, and by those political forces that have been around for a long time, especially the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and more recently emerged more extreme elements on the Islamist side, who have a vision, who have organisational discipline, who have the political skills developed over years of being repressed by secular authoritarian regimes to fall back on, and to allow them a degree of political entrepreneurship that, quite frankly, young Egyptian and young Syrians and so on are finding it difficult to muster. I think that'll change over time. Give it 5 years. We'll see the values that have brought about this revolution come more to the fore, because they will be the values that will produce answers to the things that people worry about most. But we may go through a pretty difficult few years until they have the opportunity to demonstrate that.
All right. Samah Hadid, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that, people have been dismissing this revolution even before it began. And what we saw from young people, largely young people, is this ability to outpace and surprise the world, the Arab world, the Western world. When the naysayers were coming out, or not even, responding, the media hardly responded to the initial uprisings in Tunisia. They completely ignored that. Young people responded with, infiltrating, permeating social media to ensure that their messages were getting across. And then when, these overnight experts came out and said, well, this is just frustrated youth venting, their outrage and teen angst, young people were able to mobilise millions of young, old, of every background in the Arab world to the streets. They translated this frustration that they aired through social media into offline action. And I think that is incredibly remarkable, because it reflected what you touched upon earlier, which is, I think, the revolution of the mind. Young people largely, in Tunisia to start off with, and then inspired by others in Egypt and in Syria and in Yemen and so on, were able to dismantle this fear of rising up, of speaking out, this fear that had strangled, citizens and previous generations. When I was in Egypt, I came across an older Egyptian lady who lamented her generation's inability to rise up and to speak out against the government, to remain silent in the face of brutality and authoritarianism. And she was so inspired by this movement driven by young people who, were also faced with arrest and torture, many of whom died as well, but were so committed to this cause. And it didn't allow them to be sidetracked. They were committed to this one goal. And that, I think, galvanised so many and inspired so many. And it just permeated the hearts and minds of various groups. So I think that is one of the greatest achievements of the, excuse me, I'm losing my voice, of the revolution. Now, some will say the revolution has failed, the Arab Spring has failed. We have the military rule, for instance, in Egypt, consolidating power and almost launching a counter-revolution, which is correct. A lot of the groups on the ground have this fear that, given the recent delays of the elections in Egypt, given the attacks on various groups and minorities in Egypt, we saw recently that the military is interested in consolidating power and really removing the gains that Egyptians made throughout the revolution. But I don't think that we can safely claim at this stage that the revolution has succeeded or has failed. And it is too early, as you mentioned, but we cannot to say that it's failed is really just disregarding the gains and the achievements of, like I mentioned, permeating the hearts and minds and having now this space to rise up and to take to the streets. I read a blog entry when I was in Egypt, and this blogger put it so eloquently, and he said that tonight I can go to sleep without fear of government sending their goons to kidnap me. Tonight I can go to sleep without fear of being tortured. And tonight, for the first time, I feel free. Now that is amazing in of itself. And, being in Tahrir and seeing just the most beautiful form of civil society unleashed. You had people chanting freedom songs, you had people protesting in every corner. It's the sort of movements, democratic movements, that we in the West should be in awe of. So I think that is just a feature of the remarkable achievements of these revolutions.
Okay. I want to come back to the ambassador now, because that's, I guess, the sort of, in a way, that's the romantic side of what we're seeing. The people singing in the streets, young and old, men and women, the whole bit. And it is, being there is quite inspirational. But there is also a very brutal side to this. Why don't Arab states that have a particular view on it stand up and say more loudly and more clearly, this must stop? I mean, Jordan, the UAE, Qatar have played a fairly significant role, particularly in Libya. They've sent or been involved militarily. But really, it's been left to the West to stand up and take the kind of lead, if you like, in condemning what has gone on. Why doesn't Jordan stand up and say it more loudly?
Actually, Jordan has been quite vocal in its condemnation of brutality, especially given the situation on Libya. Jordan was one of the first countries who condemned the use of force against innocent civilians. So this was a big leap for Jordanian diplomacy, being this vocal. It means that things have come to a head where Jordan could not just be a bystander. And I have to say that this position was probably in conformity with the Jordanian people who were going on a daily basis to the streets and demanding the government to do something and to do anything in order to help our Libyan brethren in this crisis. This was the government coming together with the grassroots level, if you wish, and understanding and heeding to the call of the street. They are marching daily also in front of the Syrian embassy as well. The situation with Syria is a bit different. They are next door neighbors. So Libya is...
So you wouldn't be committing your military hardware
Jordan has never ever been party to any military intervention in any Arab country. And I would remind you, in the Gulf War, in the 1990-1991 Gulf War, this was one of the reasons Jordan was punished, because we did not commit our troops against an Arab country, which is Iraq, because we had this fundamental understanding that no Arab country should be invaded by using Jordanian weaponry. And we were punished for years and years by superpowers, by the Gulf states, because of this position. But in Libya, the situation is a lot different. You have people who are demanding the help of the international community and the Arab countries to start with. You have a resolution from the Arab League. You have also a resolution from the Security Council in order to help these people. And the Jordanian intervention, if you wish, and I would just, I don't want to use intervention. It was more on the humanitarian side. We just were delivering aid and taking back rebel wounded people back to Jordan. We have hundreds of Libyan wounded people being treated in Amman.
Okay, but Qatar and the UAE, the Emirates, have done a lot more than that. They've sent warplanes, they've sent weapons. There was daily flights going from Qatar to Benghazi, dropping off all sorts of military hardware. Why are they willing to do that, but not willing really to tell the world that that's what they're doing? Is it because ultimately these countries are themselves not democratic?
Well, this is, I think we conduct in the Arab world, it's different when we conduct our business. There is a lot of reservation when you want to be vocal. The Gulf states, they have this special nature of, they are still on it's a progressive situation in the Gulf states. They're trying to have some sort of elections. I would say that this is what I was saying in the beginning, that you cannot have a simplistic approach. It's different from one country to another. UAE, they had elections just a couple of months ago to elect members of the Shura Council in UAE, and Qatar also have some sort of municipal elections as well. So are we going to measure that against what's happening in the Northern Africa? That's a bit far, bit far right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's anyone else on the panel that has a view on that matter.
I think it's a very good question, by the way, but I think the answer you should be looking forward to getting is that with regard to the Western countries, for a start, because I think that wasn't answered properly, by the way. I think just to remind everyone here that when the event started in Tunisia, and you are right in your question, people were still not knowing whether this is a serious movement or it's just another hiccup along the way, and your old Ben Ali's and Mubarak's will be back running the show. The French Foreign Affairs Minister in the French Parliament made the pledge, public pledge, to actually send French equipment to deal and control the Tunisian movement. This is on the record. She spoke, stood in front of everyone in the French Parliament and made that pledge. Now, this was about 2 weeks before Ben Ali fled Tunisia. Actually, perhaps less than 2 weeks. Now, to say that the West jumped in and supported this movement and the Arab didn't do anything, it's not very accurate, because the West stood there, waited, and as a matter of fact was actually very keen. Some strong representatives of the West were very keen to support the existing regimes, simply because there's a lot of strategic value in
investment.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we need to get that absolutely straight on now, because now you see Sarkozy, the way he talks about the French Revolution and the British, and you think, my gosh, these guys love the Arab people for who they are. Well, they don't.
Yeah.
Okay.
They propped up dictators.
So, absolutely. Now, to go back to your second part of the question, which is why aren't the Arabs doing more vocally? Well, I think the question to that is very undiplomatic from me in the presence of some diplomatic dignitaries here. I think the problem that we have is, how could you expect a regime to champion a change and a transition towards more accountability when they themselves are not really exhibiting that accountability? You're asking something to give you that which he doesn't have. And I think, unfortunately, there's a crisis. There has been a crisis across the Arab state system of a lack of legitimacy and accountability. And when the movement started, and some countries started to see that this is actually quite irreversible in many ways, it was absolutely irreversible. We could not reverse this tsunami, as we called it.
Yeah.
Therefore, you start to see different reactions to it, from people who sympathized to people who recognized, they were pushed to recognize, not even doing it willingly, to others who are starting to play more of a direct role. I mean, I can tell you Algeria, for instance, is extremely nervous about what's happening in Tunisia and Libya.
Okay, I want to bring in Professor Bowker here, because I'm a little reluctant to make it more complicated than what it already is. But there is another dimension to all of this, which is the kind of Arab-Persian dynamic, for want of a better term. Why is it that with Syria and Bahrain, we've seen the response that we have seen? And maybe you could articulate for our audience what it is, what this dynamic actually is.
Well, I think at heart there is a contest of values underway in the Middle East between a revolutionary inclusive, dynamic and progressive Arab youth, the tide that is sweeping the Arab political spectrum at the moment, and which I believe over time has every chance of reshaping much of the Arab world, on the one hand. On the other hand, you have the Iranian model, which has sought in its own way to reconcile between religion and democracy, but has largely fallen into a hidebound authoritarian regime in which religious values are being used to quell the creativity and the capabilities of ordinary Iranians, but which is nevertheless presented by the Iranians as being a more authentic Islamic model for the region to follow. Now, there is an enormous amount at stake for the future of the Arab world in the outcome of this battle between these sets of ideas. And to the extent that the Arab Spring is able to consolidate a movement in favour of critical thinking, accountability of government and so on, it'll be a very positive thing for the Arab world and a very negative thing for the Iranian regime, although quite welcome, I suspect, to the vast bulk of thoughtful Iranians. We are unlikely to be able to divorce the outcome of this struggle from political and strategic realities on the ground. There is more to this contest of ideas than the ideas themselves. And in the case of Syria, we are seeing now a regime which is embattled, which is drawing ever closer to the Iranians because of the pressures upon them from domestic opposition. And to the extent that Syria draws closer to Iran, there will be a desire on the part of the wider Arab world, and the Saudis will be especially important in this, to resist that process by which the Iranians gain strategically and perhaps over time may actually shape the nature of Syrian politics and society. So if there is a single case at the moment that I think bears watching in the region in terms of where the region may go over the next 5 to 10 years, it is certainly the situation in Syria. Personally, I have no idea where Syria is going to be 5 years from now. I fear that it will become increasingly bloody. I believe that the regime probably will survive, but in a weakened state. For Syria, or for the Syrian regime, which is an Alawite-dominated regime, this is an existential struggle. There is no tomorrow for the Alawites if they should fall from power. Perhaps for their opposition, the struggle is less existential and more likely to be the subject of some reflection on whether the value to be gained from pursuing it is sufficient to justify the blood that will be shed in its pursuit. But we really don't know just how this is going to come out.
If I can briefly add to that, I think that geopolitical situation probably reflects why it's so difficult to come up with a response, a Western response, if you like, to Syria because of the allure of Iran and the prospect of Hezbollah, coming into the picture. Earlier this year, I met Rabi al-Assad, who is the cousin of the leader of Syria, who is exiled. He is critical of his own family and the dynasty, and he's been attacked, on a number of levels because of this. He lives in London and pioneers the pro-democracy movement from London. And he said very clearly that a military intervention in Syria that we saw, in the likes of Libya, will automatically pull the Iranian trigger. will invite Iran and Hezbollah, and it's far too dangerous to go down that path. Even though he supports, the uprising in every way, he said that this situation needed a Syrian response. But I think that, the opposition that's emerged out of Syria is far too weak to establish any credible response or conclusion to these uprisings. But I think on another level, it also shows, the lack of willingness on the part of the international community to even come up with a strong response in Syria shows the hypocrisy. Why did NATO go into Libya, but not Bahrain or Yemen or various other countries? I don't know, oil comes to mind. That's a very, that's very cliched, but it's also very, obvious in that sense.
I would like to say something here about the international reaction to the Arab Spring, and especially specifically the superpowers' reaction. From our perspective, from the Arab perspective, it was interest-based. And in most examples we saw in the country, it was very slow to come, and almost always after the fact of ousting this president or the other. So they had no other choice except
they saw which horse had won.
Exactly. So it was the only horse left, as my colleague just mentioned, and they had to support the revolution, support the self-determination of the people, so to speak.
All right. Believe it or not, we're pretty close to an hour, so we do want to give you the opportunity to engage here and ask some questions if you've got any. We've got a few microphones that are roaming around the room somewhere, so perhaps if you can stick your hand up if you've got something that you'd like to ask. If you can identify which person you'd like to ask the question to, that would be helpful, and please try to make it a question rather than just a statement. I can't actually see where the microphones are. There's one here. And there's one over there. So there's someone there in the fourth row from the back with headphones, which I presume are not on. I hope you've been listening. And just a warning, if you are going to ask a question, this discussion is being broadcast on Radio National on the ABC. So, prepare to go public with whatever it is you've got to say. Go ahead.
Hi, just wanted to ask the panel what they think of the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood gaining power in Egypt, considering their current mission statement today as the Quran is our Lord, jihad is our way, and our highest honour is to die for Allah. That's part of their present mission statement. What do you think is the possibility of them taking power in Egypt and implementing Sharia law?
All right, I wanted to let's start with Samah, and I'm sure you'll all have something to say on this. Is there that much, Samah, do you think, to fear from the Muslim Brotherhood? Because I guess that's the perception, particularly in countries like Australia, of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood.
Yeah, the Islamist boogeyman, which, look, to be fair, we don't get enough information, and the information that we get about these certain groups is quite biased. We don't know enough about what these groups stand for. And when it comes to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they don't actually have a majority popular support. If they were to run in an election, which they will, they probably will receive a marginal proportion of the votes, but it wouldn't be substantial. But I think over the years they have changed, and I don't know enough about it, but what I do know from friends of mine who are connected to these groups in Egypt only is that they have renounced violence. So for them it's not part of their modus operandi as such, and just because they base their policies, for instance, which is very superficial at this stage, on, say, an Islamist sort of spirit, doesn't necessarily mean that they're against democracy as such. But, time will tell whether or not, they do get into power and what they do with that.
Okay, Fethi, there is the often made connection between the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. Is it not reasonable to fear what they might represent in power?
I think the biggest problem that we are seeing right now, and I'm just talking about a party in Tunisia which is, I feel like, an offshoot or significantly influenced by the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the Renaissance Party, the Ennahda Party. And I can tell you that the biggest problem that has been witnessed by this electoral campaign that is coming to an end this weekend is this in my view, and with all due respect to the person who asked the question, this kind of imposed polarization, really imposed external polarization of the debates. And what I mean by that is people went to this revolution demanding reform and demanding a freedom to choose who they want to govern them. And what do we get right now? We get debates in the West about the extent to which a party that might have some connections to the Muslim Brotherhood gaining power. It's all hypothetical anyway. I think in Tunisia, the Nahda, which is extremely professional, has 20 years of credibility in terms of fighting the Ben Ali regime, is only polling at maximum 30% of the votes. And they're the most resourced, best financed party. The most they can get is 30%.
Okay.
And Nahda has made a clear distinction between wanting to keep a separation between state and religion. Yeah. So they say, we don't mind that our party is inspired by Islam in terms of certain values, but we are certainly not going to go for an Islamist state. We want a civic state.
All right. I want to throw it over to Bob Bowker. You wanted to say something.
A few things, actually, but I'll be as brief as I can. Firstly, in regard to the Brotherhood in Egypt, it has many elements. There are at least three distinct parts of the Brotherhood. As an ambassador, in fact, I had a fair bit of contact with the Brotherhood and came to appreciate that one element of it is quite progressive and innovative and open-minded on all sorts of social and economic matters. But there is also a traditionalist element within the Brotherhood, which I think may, in the short term, be the dominant force in the Brotherhood, especially over the next couple of years. It will do well in the elections, not only because it is the best organised of the forces in Egypt, but because the secular side of Egyptian politics is quite frankly very weak. And although they may not poll more than 20 or 30% of the votes, the secular side will poll much worse than that. So I think you can expect to see a Muslim Brotherhood-dominated Egyptian parliament that will form a constitutional assembly that will then proceed to negotiate with the military over the allocation of power and responsibility within Egyptian society. Now, under those circumstances, and this was where we pick up Hamas, I think you will find that the Egyptian military will continue to insist to have the dominant voice on matters to do with Egyptian national security and foreign policy and the relationship with Israel. The Brotherhood will probably, after a lot of negotiation, agree that its focus for the time being at least, and we don't know how long that time being will be on addressing social and educational and other issues to strengthen the Ummah, the Islamic society in Egypt, and it will have a lot of popular support for doing that, provided it does not try to impose its wishes upon the population at large.
Okay.
So we're into a political process now which could go on for some time.
All right. The Ambassador has something to say. If we could just make it quick, because there's lots of people who want to...
Yes, I'll just have it. This is a very, very important question this gentleman asked. But I do believe that we should not fear the idea of Islamists being in Parliament. They are part and parcel of the society. Yeah. They are a component. This is a very important transitional stage. It should be inclusive. It should have all spheres of the society. And even if we look to the West, in Germany you have Christian parties ruling. So, and Germany just comes to my mind. There are also other examples in the world. So we should not fear, and we should not use this as a fear campaign in the West towards Muslim Brotherhood. Last thing I wanted to say, from my last readings, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they only have around 2 million following, so that's less than 1% of the society. So this should not be a reason to have a fear campaign about them. Thank you.
Okay, I'd also just add to that if we are going to be consistent in our values, we cannot turn around and argue against inclusion of the Brotherhood in the political process. That would be completely improper. And the alternatives to involvement of the Brotherhood would be repression. And repression of the Brotherhood would not stop at repression creation of the Brotherhood. You would, in fact, repress political freedoms across the board.
Great question. Thank you very much. All right, we've got a question here in the fourth row from a lady with brown hair, if we can get a microphone there. Is there anyone else that I can get a microphone to? There's a couple. Is there anyone over this side? There's someone here, and we'll try and get to you in a minute. If we can take your question, please. And if you wouldn't mind just standing up and also introducing yourself when you ask the question.
Hi, my name is Serpil. Turkey is being used as an example by the West as the model country in the Middle East that the countries that have been uprising should look towards in terms of the democracy that they should adopt. Yet this is a little bit concerning for me because even though on the surface Turkey looks like the model democratic country, it is actually going through a lot of anti-democratic issues at the moment. For instance, the Turkish government is rounding up all the former military generals in a case known as Ergenekon, and also prominent journalists who are outspoken against the Turkish government and actually putting them in jail without any trial. So is this the sort of model that the Arab world would like to embrace while the West would like to? Okay,
we'll come back and answer that in a moment. If we can get a microphone just up to this end of that side, and we'll take a question from there. And in the meantime, this gentleman here.
Hi. Before I ask my question, I just wanted to say that the Egyptian Coptic Church has given figures of 100,000 Christians having immigrated since March from Egypt as a byproduct of this Arab Spring. And as we romanticise the Arab Spring, and like the media don't really go deeply into it, don't you think there's a risk of propagating this almost Walt Disney-like story, whilst at the same time failing to explore the geopolitical issues affecting a lot of what's happening, particularly in places like Syria and Bahrain, and the interventions of the governments of Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar in the arming of and financing of fundamentalist organisations in the hope that they can achieve their geopolitical ends in the Middle East by fantasising the Arab Spring? Yep. Are we really not ignoring what's really happening from a geopolitical perspective in the Arab world at the moment?
Okay, we'll come to that. In fairness to our panellists, I don't think they're glossing over anything. I think we've got through quite a lot of detail. We've got a question up the back here, the lady with the microphone.
Hi, my name's Robin. Look, I backpacked through that whole area, all through Syria and Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey. And one thing that really struck me was the difference between what was going on, like what was going on in the streets, and what we hear about in the news here. That it wasn't just a selection of information, it was a total distortion. What I was reading in Australian newspapers was like in a different world to what was going on around me. I'd just like you to comment on what you think of the information coverage of the Arab Spring in Australia and in the West, and how much of the story are we getting, and are we actually getting the story at all? Yeah. Okay, great. Excellent question. Thank you. We'll go through those one by one. We'll just try and keep the answers quick if possible to these because we're running out of time. Fethi Mansouri, the Turkey example, a good one or a bad one, do you think?
I think Turkey has been talked about as a possible example simply because Turkey is predominantly a Muslim country. The current leadership of Turkey come from the Justice and I think Development Party, Islamist party, if you like, between inverted commas, and it managed to maintain a kind of a secular system of governance. Whilst being relatively, Turkey, by the way, right now is hailed as one of the emerging middle powers in that part of the world because of the economic performances and because of what they've been doing. So I think it is looked at as a potential model where a predominantly Muslim country is able to embark on a significant democratization process with quite relative success, if you like. And obviously the issue of the Kurds notwithstanding, they still have problems in that area. I don't agree with the premise that people are fantasizing about the Arab Spring, or perhaps they should not consider all this geopolitics, because in my view that statement, that kind of thinking in itself is quite almost patronizing towards the masses who rose up and demanded change, because people are demanding change, not thinking about geopolitics, not really thinking about how their demands for change will affect the status quo, the powers that be in the region. What they're really wanting to do is, they said enough is enough. And this was, by the way, a movement in Egypt well before this thing, I think, the Kifaya movement. And the same thing in Tunisia and other places. So
okay,
they wanted change.
To be fair, I think the question here was more about the way we're looking at it and trying to interpret it. So, Samah, do you think then that perhaps as outsiders we're missing the point by getting swept up in the kind of Walt Disney revolution idea and ignoring the fact that you've got Qatar arming, hundreds of thousands of Libyans with pretty expensive machinery?
Do we know that Qatar is doing that, though?
And this goes back to the question. I've seen the flights landing in Benghazi.
No. I'm saying as outsiders, we don't have enough information of this. I'm not doubting that it is happening. I'm saying that we cannot grasp what's going on because we don't read enough into it, and our news outlets are far too biased and not nuanced enough to actually go into the geopolitical aspects of this region and what is emerging at the moment. So it goes back to your question about the information that we're receiving in the Australian context anyway, is just far too superficial, and I think you can comment on that as a journalist. In terms of your work with Al Jazeera.
We've been covering it all year in we've been covering it all year in our TV programme.
But there isn't enough attention
because not enough people watch. So I think that says everything about what we think people are willing. It's a fair point that every time I do a report about something in the Arab Spring, the numbers drop off entirely. So we've devoted hours to covering the Arab Spring, and you don't really want to know, I don't think.
But it's because you worry about rating. If you kept rating out of the equation and really pursued journalism for the sake of information, then you wouldn't worry about whether
I don't care about ratings.
It's not you, but
it's the Murdochs.
But I think also,
Ambassador, I'd just like you to respond very briefly, if you can, to Robin's question about the Arab street view versus Western perception and understanding. Do you think there's a deliberate distortion, or do you think that, in fact, we just don't really understand in the West? We don't get it?
I think we have to agree that there is some degree of ignorance from both sides. I think it is worth studying and looking into. If you want to understand my part of the world, you have to really want to understand it. But as you mentioned, that the ratings are going down every time you make a story about the Arab Spring, that says a lot about the audiences in Australia. It is not their focal interest, actually, to listen to that. But Australia, I have to emphasize this. Australia, as a middle power, a rising power, does have interests in our region. And I think it is in Australia's interest to be present and to be influential in the region. Australia has an immense experience in democracy and good governance. It could do a lot of good if it was in our region. The way we look at it now in the Arab world, yes, there is this skeptical view of the West because of a huge there is a history behind this. There is a lot. We feel Arabs feel that there is really double standards in international policies, and the biggest example would be the Palestinian situation. These are people who have been under occupation for the last 63 years. The only people under occupation, the only people the UN could not help up till now.
I think you're unleashing something right at the end here. We've got time for two more questions, so to stick with the theme, we'll take one from the east and one from the west. So if we can have a microphone up the back. Here's a lady with the microphone already, and if we can give one to someone over here. If you could stand up so we could see you and go for it.
Hi, my name's Susan. I was actually in Damascus for 2 years teaching at the British Council, and I visited again in April this year, and I've visited several times. But in April, I discovered several things that just aren't getting reported in Australia, and I agree with the Ambassador, we need greater analysis, and we're just not getting it in Australia. One thing I was aware of was the killings of soldiers. This was in April. and not only soldiers but civilians, by armed gangs. But when that's reported, it's the government says, or the regime says, armed gangs, but they're a reality for Syrian people.
Yeah. All right, so the question?
My question is in regard to women. I taught hundreds of Syrian women. They're very modern, sophisticated women, dressing like people in this audience. You can't tell whether they're Muslim or Christian. But when I see pictures of women demonstrating against the government, they're often in black, they're wearing niqabs. Can you tell me what is the future for Syrian women, please?
Okay. All right, so that's the question. What's the future for Syrian women? And our question over here, I'm sorry if you can keep it very quick. We're going to be thrown out in any second.
Yes, Sam. I work with Coptics in Australia, and it's not just that over 100,000 have left since the revolution.
Yep.
The population in Australia has increased 20%.
So the question is?
So my question is, are we in the West ignoring this problem because we're being highlighted by hope?
Okay, which problem are we ignoring? Sorry, just to be clear.
The plight of the Coptic Christians in Egypt.
Okay. All right. Well, let's deal with the Copts in Egypt first with Professor Bowker, given that you were the ambassador there. I mean, is there a level of ignorance, or is it just not really on the agenda?
Well, it's certainly on the agenda at the moment, especially because of the horrific events of the 9th of October, when the military overreacted to a demonstration and 25 or more people were killed and hundreds were injured. But the heart of that problem is the delay in transferring political authority from the military to an elected civilian government. And I endorse the comment that was made earlier that one of the things which will best address issues of civil society in the Arab world is getting on with establishing electoral outcomes that will enable a legitimate government to take decisions. Part of the problem with the October event was that there had been a series of incidents in Upper Egypt which had not been addressed properly by the local authorities, and the military, for its part, failed to recognise the severity of the political issue that was emerging. Over time, I think that these issues will be better handled by credible democratically elected governments than they have been under authoritarian regimes.
All right. The organisers are about to start an uprising, but just to answer the question about women in Syria, Ambassador, Jordan really has a reputation for giving women a platform, for women having a platform, a deserved platform. Do you hold out much hope for women's rights in Syria if this uprising/revolution doesn't go much further?
Absolutely, absolutely. Syria is our next door neighbor. So I cannot tell you that there are a lot of differences between women's rights in Jordan and women's rights in Syria. Syria is a big country, important country with a huge culture and a huge heritage behind it. Syrian women have been pioneers in every field. So I am very optimistic for the future of women in Syria. But I would personally refer this question to my colleague who's been on the ground and talking with Syrian women.
Samah, I'll give you a tweet, 140 characters or less.
Well, I'll answer both questions by this way. The revolutions and the revolutions that are continuing on today are about inclusion. They're about men and women coming together. They're about Muslims and Christians and atheists coming together to demand, freedom and human rights and democracy from their regimes. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in Egypt, yes, is this military exploitation of the tensions that have already been, very much deep-rooted in Egyptian society. And there are absolutely tensions amongst Coptics and Muslims. And Coptics have traditionally been marginalised and discriminated against. And this has been exploited by the military over the years and by the old regimes as well. But they're standing up now and they're realising this. And I would hope that for women as well, you know, what I saw on the streets of Egypt and in Syria were women at the forefront of these protests, you know, sticking it to the military and the regimes. And this was a remarkable revolution as well. So for women anyway. So I think that if these revolutions are and these uprisings are to succeed, that they need to carry on with this narrative of being inclusive and providing equality to those that have traditionally been marginalised.
So much more than a tweet. Samah Hadid, Professor Fethi Mansouri, Professor Bob Bowker, and the Ambassador from Jordan, Her Excellency Mrs. Rima Ahmad Alaadeen. Thank you very much for your time. We're really grateful for your insights. And thank you to you, our audience. I hope it's been a good discussion, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good night.